Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating journey. We're going to explore how the simple credit card evolved from just a convenient piece of plastic in your pocket into an incredibly powerful, highly complex mechanism for tracking and even shaping human behavior all over the globe. It's a wild story about technology, psychology, and public policy. So let's jump right in.
Here's a quick roadmap of what we'll cover today. We're looking at the rise of plastic, how companies exploit our behavioral biases, tracking carbon footprints, the gun code controversy, the ripple effects of financial regulation, and finally, social credit systems.
All right, Part 1, the rise of plastic. Let's take a brief look at the history of credit cards.
So our journey actually starts way back in the 1920s. Back then, you literally carried around heavy metal charge plates tied to just one single department store. Kind of a hassle, right? Well, in 1950, a forgotten wallet at a business dinner led Diners Club to create a cardboard universal charge card. Then, in 1958, Bank Americard, which you definitely know today as Visa, launched the very first general-purpose bank card. Fast forward to the 1980s, the magnetic stripe completely revolutionized the game with electronic authorization. And today, in the 2010s and beyond, digital wallets have built this incredibly fast, vast electronic payment network.
Which brings us to Part 2, exploiting consumer behavioral biases. This is all about the hidden psychology behind credit offers.
As this electronic network blew up, financial firms got incredibly good at collecting our data, and more importantly, using it to screen and exploit behavioral biases. A massive study analyzing 1.3 million credit card offers uncovered a widely used practice called shrouding. And honestly, it's exactly what it sounds like. Issuers intentionally obscure the less appealing terms of a contract. They bury the text at the absolute bottom, use tiny fonts, or hide the details in a maze of legal jargon. If you've ever just blindly clicked "I agree" on a terms and conditions page just to move on with your day, well, you've experienced firsthand exactly why this tactic works so well.
It's all about how they balance the offer. Companies will aggressively market the shiny, front-loaded perks. We're talking 0% introductory rates or low uniform annual fees. But they shroud the backloaded fees, the punishingly high default APRs, late payment penalties, and over-limit fees. What researchers found is that this tactic is very specifically targeted at consumers with lower education levels, essentially preying on limited attention spans or the human tendency to only focus on immediate, short-term benefits.
Now, here is the truly surprising part: the timing of when card issuers lean into these tactics. When state-level unemployment insurance increases, it actually acts as a positive shock to consumer creditworthiness. Basically, people have a bit more of a safety net. You might naturally think issuers would offer better, clearer terms, right? Actually, no. Issuers actively increase their reliance on these hidden, backloaded fees. They exploit that temporary boost in creditworthiness to maximize short-term profits, even knowing those acquired consumers might be way more likely to default down the road.
Let's shift gears to Part 3, tracking your carbon footprint and the move toward values-based spending.
The pandemic fundamentally changed how a lot of us view our daily spending. According to global research, 54% of consumers around the world now say reducing their carbon footprint is significantly more important to them than it was before COVID-19. And with that massive spike in passion for the environment, payment networks realized something huge. They had the perfect infrastructure already in place to turn everyday purchases into meaningful action for the planet. Let's look at how this plays out in practice. MasterCard developed a carbon calculator that uses independent data to measure the carbon emissions of your purchases. It literally converts your spending data into relatable metrics, like telling you exactly how many trees it would take to absorb the CO2 from your grocery run. Meanwhile, Malaysia's Maybank launched the My Impact card. It automatically tracks your footprint across 16 different categories and actively shapes your behavior by rewarding ESG-friendly purchases, like EV charging with cashback. You can even seamlessly use your points to donate to reforestation projects.
It's an absolutely incredible tool for sustainability. But this level of granular tracking leads to a fascinating and honestly pretty polarizing question for this explainer. If the payment network can track the environmental impact of every single purchase you make, what else can it track?
That leads us right into Part 4, the gun code controversy, where payment tracking becomes a major political flashpoint.
To understand this debate, we first need to understand merchant category codes, or MCCs. An MCC is just a standard 4-digit classification number. Take your dog to the vet, and the transaction gets tagged with the code 0742. Simple enough. But recently, a proposal to create a specific, unique MCC exclusively for firearm retailers sparked a massive national debate.
The debate goes like this. Gun control groups strongly argue that this specific code could help law enforcement detect suspicious purchasing behavior, pointing to mass shootings where perpetrators bought thousands of dollars of firearms on credit right before an attack. On the other side, a quote from Visa's CEO perfectly highlights the system's inherent limitations. He pointed out that if one person buys a tent and a thermos at a sporting goods store and another person buys a rifle and ammunition at that exact same store, the credit card network just sees the store code. It literally doesn't know what's in the shopping bag.
This tracking mechanism has entirely fractured the country. Looking at the legislative landscape, 20 states, including Arkansas, Texas, and Florida, have explicitly banned the use of this code, arguing that it acts as a backdoor registry, infringing on Second Amendment privacy. But at the same time, states like California, Colorado, and New York have gone the exact opposite route, passing laws that legally mandate the use of the code. It is a textbook example of how everyday payment infrastructure has become a battleground for public policy.
Moving right along to Part 5, Unintended Consequences of Regulation. Let's examine the ripple effects of fee caps.
Following the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve capped debit card interchange fees at 21 cents for large banks. The goal was noble: lower fees for merchants so they could pass the savings on to us, the consumers. But let's follow the chain reaction. The cap is implemented, and large banks suddenly lose billions in debit card revenue. To recoup those massive losses, banks drastically raise consumer checking account fees and aggressively start pushing unregulated high-reward credit cards instead, and that brings us to the ultimate unintended consequence.
The bottom line is represented by this staggering number, $25.2 billion. Because banks heavily incentivize consumers to switch from low-fee debit cards to high-reward credit cards, merchants faced a $25.2 billion increase in credit card fees that offset nearly 70% of the savings the debit cap was supposed to create in the first place. And worse, the ripple effect hit lower-income Americans the hardest. They were priced out of basic checking accounts due to the new fees and largely lacked the credit scores to access the lucrative premium cards everyone else was switching to.
Finally, we arrive at Part 6, Scoring Society. Social credit, the ultimate tracking machine.
What actually happens when tracking moves completely beyond banks and becomes a fully integrated state-run social credit system? Researchers studied a Chinese city that they anonymized as Merit Town. There, local officials operate a system tied directly to citizens' national IDs. Everyone in the city of 1 million people starts out with exactly 1,000 points. From there, the government aggressively tracks and scores everyday behaviors using a deeply detailed matrix of 389 rules. 124 of those rules reward good behavior, and 265 rules punish bad behavior.
Think about how they classify severe offenses here. There are 71 specific actions that will instantly tank your overall letter grade, dropping you straight from an A to a B. And remarkably, a quarter of these severe offenses are purely political. The most common political offense? Legally petitioning the local government. So actions entirely within the bounds of the law can still severely damage your social credit if local authorities decide you're being disruptive to their agenda.
This creates a genuinely bizarre mathematical reality. The stakes are very real. Top AAA scorers get perks like discounts on winter heating bills, while anyone scoring a D faces active police monitoring. But unlike a legal system that considers nuance and context, this is pure math. Completing 300 hours of volunteer work earns you 50 points, which mathematically cancels out the 50-point penalty for domestic abuse. Plus, the system is highly unequal. Marginalized rural residents end up absorbing 28% of all penalties, but only have access to 6% of the reward opportunities compared to people in the city.
Now, you might assume a system like this only targets regular citizens, right? Interestingly, government employees actually face much more intense, moralized scrutiny. They are subjected to heightened internal surveillance and get penalized for minor stuff like having a bad attitude with a client or playing cards at work. Turns out playing solitaire at a government desk costs you way more than just productivity. But they're also given a lot more avenues to accumulate massive reward points. Ordinary citizens face less granular daily scrutiny, but they're stuck relying on low-value rewards, having to volunteer for 10 hours just to scrape together 2 measly points. It's a fascinating look at a state using digital scoring to deeply discipline its own agents right alongside the public.
Which brings us to the very end of our explainer. We started this journey looking at clunky metal charge plates and somehow arrived at algorithms mathematically scoring human morality. As we accelerate toward a completely cashless society, the incredible evolution of the payment network leaves us with one final profound question to consider. As every single transaction becomes a data point, who will ultimately write the code that shapes your behavior? Thanks so much for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you.